ba 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 boo ba ba. Who's the man who will speak the truth? Boo ba 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 boo ba ba. Lone candles that burn. Who's the man who will bring light into your life? Boo ba 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 boo. Ba-ba, lone candles that burn. Who's the man who digs through human excrement to present you the gems? Boo, ba-ba, ba-boo, ba-boo, ba-ba, lone candles that burn. Who's the man who kinda sometimes knows what he's talking about? Boo, ba-ba, ba-ba-da-boo. Ba-ba, lone candles that burn. Who's the man who has a scatterbrained, low IQ, and weak memory recall? Boo, ba-ba, ba-ba-da-boo. Ba-ba, lone candles that burn. Welcome to Lone Candle Live. It's another episode of ReplyGuying with Lone Candle. Now, and there's my cursor. So here, ReplyGuying on this, and essentially what I'm trying to say in my reply that we will read in a minute while I first pre-ramble about the reply is that the United States attack on Venezuela was justified. Does that mean it was legal? No. In fact, it was clearly unconstitutional. Does that mean it was a good idea? No, not necessarily. You got to look into a lot of factors to see whether it was a good idea. Does that even mean it was in total moral? Well, you've got to look at all the consequences and your ability to judge the consequences and whether you did the due diligence when attacking to know whether it was overall moral. So I'm not even quite talking about that. More just a base level. Was it justified on some base level? And I say yes. Again, not saying it was legal, not saying it was a good idea, not even yet commenting on whether overall it was a moral attack, but it meets some minimal level of justification. And because it meets the lone candle doctrine, which is you combine two things. One is a legitimate threat. It doesn't have to be an immediate threat. It could be a down the road, but as long as it's a legitimately reasonable threat with an extremely evil and illegitimate regime. So Venezuela is near the United States. Venezuela, it works with Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. It works with China and Russia. In fact, Russia has flown its really nice bombers in Venezuela before and landed them there. If there is some sort of conflict between the U.S. and Russia or the U.S. and China, Venezuela could be a real problem if Venezuela allowed those countries to put some sort of armaments there, whether it's missiles or planes. So the country of Venezuela, being near the U.S., touching the Gulf of Mexico, also known as the Gulf of America, having rival great powers with potentially military influence there is a legitimate threat. In addition, he supports the drug trade, but I see that as more of a demand problem and not something we should invade someone else over or attack someone else over. Now, that alone, this threat I've just described, pretty much justifies every country attacking every other country until the end of time, because every nearby country is potentially a threat. And unless they're loyal to you, that's a danger. But then, once you control that country, isn't the country next to that country also potentially a threat? But they could threaten your ability to control the closer country. So you have endless threat. And so that alone does not justify attacking, but is an important part. We have a legitimate, reasonable threat of Venezuela, which works with rivals that could be in war with the United States in the not too distant future. Now, you've got to combine that with an inherently evil and illegitimate regime. Maduro, he stays in power by stealing the resources from his people and by allying with drug gangs, drug cartels. He had an election that everyone agrees he stole. So he's fundamentally an illegitimate leader, meaning attacking him, trying to get rid of him, well, that's justified. There's no inherent right to the Venezuelan people you're violating. Nope, because Venezuelan people don't have a say. This drug cartel allied dictator is the only one with the say. And at that point, you don't really have a right to, oh no, but this is me doing my stuff. Because no, you're not doing your stuff. You're just a dictator lording over other people while working with our enemies, being a direct threat. So when you combine those things at some basic level, an attack is justified. And saying that I commented it on this video probably means I think they didn't believe that. But I watched this 2 weeks ago. So anywho, here's what I actually said. When you combine that Russia and China have active influence in Venezuela, and the U.S. may be in war with these great powers soon, meaning Venezuela is a legitimate military threat to the U.S. if it allows China and Russia to operate there in a war. When you combine that with the illegitimacy of the Maduro regime shown by the stolen election and massive outmigration, U.S. intervention is justified. To which someone said, which is a very good rhetorical point, and frankly, I think is not overall a good point, but it does bring in a few gray areas, is, well, does that apply to Ukraine as well? I mean, since it's on the Russian border. Well, let's see. I applied a two tests answered right here. When you combine that illegitimacy combined with foreign threat influence. So certainly, one thing, Ukraine was probably never going to become part of NATO before Russia invaded. It requires every single NATO country to agree to bring a country in. And it didn't look like Ukraine was anywhere, even really on a path to ever get every country to agree to that. But nevertheless, yeah, having influence, if NATO and the United States were potentially able to get influence in Ukraine, and Ukraine certainly was trying to lean westward, at least economically, well, yeah, that makes Ukraine at some point a potential threat to Russia. And so I'd say you could argue it meets the first requirement in the same way Venezuela does for the U.S. Now, I think Russia greatly exaggerates the extent that Ukraine was a threat to the point of lying, but at a minimal barrier, it does meet it. It doesn't meet the second, though. Ukraine is a democracy. It has some serious corruption. There was the Maidan Revolution, which there's heavy protests and forced their leader to essentially resign and let who the protesters wanted in lead the country. There was some violence in the Maidan Revolution. It's actually debated whether it was really the protesters who started it or the regime forces. Regime forces definitely killed people in the protesters. But nevertheless, that was largely a democratic protest, a very strong and persistent one that then caused that leader to leave. And of course, the reason there was a protest is because he betrayed his people and tried to ally with Russia when that's not what they wanted. And so basically he was more beholden to a foreign empire, the Russian Empire, than he was to his own people, and that produced the big protest. And so there is a bit of a gray area there, because ideally he loses in a democratic election, not a massive protest that also has some violence involved with it. But nevertheless, Ukraine was still fairly a democracy, and nothing compared to this ridiculously corrupt regime in Venezuela that frankly ran Venezuela to the ground. Venezuela used to be a really successful and wealthy country, but the socialist dictatorship ran it to the freaking ground, and it now just stays in power by force. So the comparison is ridiculous, frankly, on the legitimacy part. All right, so this is what I said. I said when you combine, Ukraine was a struggling democracy. Maduro was a dictator who stole an election and stayed in power by force. So there isn't this second thing to combine it with. Ukraine wasn't cooperating militarily with the West until Russia invaded Crimea. Russia already had land borders with NATO, and Ukraine doesn't change that. There's no reason for Russia to be in war with NATO other than Russian aggression, so they had nothing to fear. The US had a good chance of being in war with Russia or China because of their aggression, meaning Russia and Chinese aggression, on their democratic neighbors. Putin invaded Ukraine because he sees Ukraine as a fake country that rightfully belongs to Russia, not out of military threat. He did it to stop Ukraine from joining the European Union, not NATO. But yeah, the further you can push your border out, the larger cushion you have. So there's always a possible defensive motive to wanting control over influence in nearby territories. So I actually do have a piece. It's one of my better pieces, I think so, about why Russia invaded Crimea and the different reasons that they would and whether it's justified. And basically doing that deep dive, I really came to the conclusion that Putin, who's the one who made the decision, it wasn't Russia who made the decision. Russia didn't decide. Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia, decided. He invaded Ukraine because he's clearly for decades had this ideology that the fall of the Soviet Union, which was essentially a Russian empire, was some great travesty, and that Ukraine is Russian. Ukraine is not a real country. The Ukrainians belong to Russia. And when you look at his history of statements, he doesn't really seem that afraid of NATO over time. What he does seem to be very concerned about is Ukraine moving westward, Ukraine economically and culturally moving towards Europe. And that protest that ousted a leader that tried to move him towards Russia and put in someone to move him towards the West, and that made very clear Ukraine wanted to and was moving towards the West, specifically Europe, and getting closer to the European Union economically. Well, that made Putin think, oh crap, we're going to lose Ukraine. Well, I'm not allowing that to happen. I'm invading. That's what it was really about. Yeah. And so I'm also making the point essentially that while I kind of acknowledge to some extent low bar, Ukraine does meet the first requirement. Venezuela qualifies for it more because, frankly, Russia is not going to be in war with NATO or the United States unless Russia attacks someone. There's no realistic version where NATO starts a war with Russia, and therefore Ukraine is only a threat to Russia and any other nearby country if Russia starts a war, which means they're not really a threat unless Russia plans on having aggressive wars. Well, that's not really the case with Venezuela, where, well, the really good chance of the U.S. being in war is with China trying to invade Taiwan, which is a country that's democratically governed itself for some time now, and they don't want to be a part of China. All right. He said there was a coup, like you mentioned. With this coup, there was many new anti-Russian language and cultural laws that came with it. So, yeah, after that coup, which I don't even know it's right to call a coup, it was a democratic protest that had a leader design, but it is a bit of a gray area. The Ukraine started trying to make Ukrainian the official language and the language of the state. It didn't ban Russian. It was just trying to make Ukraine's official language, which I think, probably isn't ideal. There's probably legitimate criticisms of that. But also, the idea that a country wants to have an official language for its government and that they want themselves to be one people, that makes a lot of sense. And again, it didn't ban Russian in private life. And nevertheless, that doesn't add up to being anything like Maduro, these language laws. And so that alone doesn't add much for justifying an invasion, or that the leader was fundamentally corrupt or some sort of crazy dictator, or horrible dictator like Maduro. I don't know if he was crazy, but Many people in the East did not recognize the new Victoria Nuland cookie government. And so there they're referring to, I forget what Victoria Nuland's actual position was, but she was in the U.S. government, and she was involved with that protest. But the U.S. had very little influence over that protest. Yes, we encourage it to the extent that we can. We try to fund pro-democracy groups. Certainly there was a discussion where she and another official were saying, hey, who would be our preferred leader? And some set that up to go, look, they're choosing a leader. Now, just because you discuss who you prefer doesn't mean you actually get to make the choice. Those protests were driven by Ukrainians who wanted to move west and didn't like that their leader wasn't doing that. The U.S. had minimal influence in that, and this is just sort of a canard that, there's some sort of pro-democracy protest that must just be the United States doing. No. Victoria Nuland had minimal influence. And the cookie part, I just realized why there's the cookie. She gave out cookies during one of the protests. So she gave some cookies out. And that means, this is just some sort of BS fake government? No, that's Russian propaganda. Rightfully so. This entire coup was influenced by the West. Again, sure, the U.S. supported it, but they really played a pretty minimal role. It was Ukrainians who wanted this to happen. It's not like it was engineered from Washington. Not the first time in history, and not the last either. There's a whole bunch of accusations of the U.S. interfering, and many of them are horribly exaggerated. Like the U.S., sure, try to support democracy, try to fund democracy groups, but ultimately it requires the people on the ground to want democracy. And basically, both China and Russia like to say, look, I don't respect this. This is just an American puppet state, rather than realizing, no, the Americans provided some really basic support, but no, this was the people of that country wanting to be a democracy, and no, not wanting to be a part of the authoritarian East. And there's other times where the CIA fucked up and was more involved in certain coups. But U.S. is certainly not perfect. But that's beside the point here, at least. These so-called democracies you're talking about is this puppet states of the U.S. disguised as a democracy. Until a country has the slightest negative opinion of the U.S./EU, then it automatically becomes a corrupt dictatorship. Romania, latest election, or Georgia. I'm not on top of the details of what he's referring to, Romania and Georgia, but this is nonsense. I mean, the idea that, yes, they're just puppets disguised as democracy. All these Eastern European countries that used to be a part of the Soviet Union and other countries. I mean, that's just nonsense. And, look at what we're talking about here. It has the slightest negative opinion, and then it becomes a corrupt dictatorship. Right now we're talking about Venezuela and Ukraine. So Venezuela would be the country that he would be accusing, yes, it had the slightest negative opinion and became a corrupt dictatorship. Does he know anything about Venezuela? It's having mass out-migration. There was a wealthy country that now became a poor country. It's controlled more by drug cartels than it is by its own people. It has a leader that is happy to kill and jail political opponents, who stole an election, and whose military is nicknamed its own cartel. I forget the exact name, but it's nicknamed. It had its own cartel name because they're so corrupt. And so that is not the same as, that's the slightest negative opinion. This is just nonsense. Okay, this is hypocrisy at its finest, but good that it happens. Hope EU leaders are taking notes from this, and also the threat to Greenland become more independent. Oh no, Greenland's fucked up. I don't have a defense for that. Let's see. It wasn't EU, but NATO that was a hard line. EU is nothing more than a cooperation and a big market, while NATO puts Western troops in a much larger area than before. Essentially, Ukraine got no closer to joining NATO. It was getting no closer. What it was taking a major step to getting closer to joining the EU. And then Russia invaded. So the trigger, there was nothing about NATO that would have been a trigger. There was something about the EU. And that was the trigger, because Putin doesn't want Ukraine to get closer and closer economically and culturally to the EU. The worst thing that could happen is that Ukraine gets to the EU and actually starts to develop. I mean, look at Poland. Poland has been an extremely successful country after it got off the Russian Empire, which the Soviet Union was a version of the Russian Empire. If something like that happened to Ukraine, wow, that's a culture that's fairly similar to Russia. The Russian people would have to look, hey, why are we still under this dictatorship when they're living under democracy and, by being with the West, are really economically successfully? That would threaten Putin's regime. So he even has personal self-preservation for not wanting Ukraine to join the West. But it's not about NATO. It's actually about the EU. It's about economic connections. So this is just ahistorical, and everything I've looked into about actual Putin, when you add it all up for decades, he's concerned about Russian Empire. Like, he really cares about Ukraine passionately being a part of Russia. Like, it's a passion for him. He believes it. Like, they must be a part of Russia. It's a good to him. And it would be a great evil for them to go further west. Which is why he invaded. Not because of some imagined fear about NATO, a defensive alliance. I think just all the available evidence shows it's about the EU, not NATO, and this guy's just wrong about that. All right, so I said the coup was mostly driven by Ukrainians. Sure, the West supported it, but they didn't create or drive it. Ukraine was not simply a puppet state, it was a struggling democracy. It had corruption, but was still a democracy. Your description of Ukraine as simply a puppet state is just false. Democracies have negative opinions of the US and EU all the time, and they are still considered democracies. France complains about both all the time. The UK left the EU. The US still considers them democracies. A centrist won Romania's most recent election. We are talking about Venezuela here. It didn't automatically become a corrupt dictatorship because it was critical of the US/EU. It has been a dictatorship for decades and is ruled by a drug cartel alliance force. Ukraine, compared to that, is a great democracy. There are clear differences, so it's not hypocrisy. Putin knows NATO wouldn't attack Russia. He knew that Ukraine wasn't anywhere close to being in NATO. He also knows that if Ukraine became integrated with Europe and the EU, it would become less and less Russian, and Russia would lose that imperial territory forever. If the integration was successful and Ukraine developed economically, it could even make the Russian people question why they live under a dictatorship when the Ukrainians are doing well under democracy and connected to the West. Putin invaded after Ukraine took steps toward economic integration, not military integration. If NATO was the hard line, then invading Crimea makes no sense because Ukraine wasn't getting any closer to NATO. It was getting closer to the EU. Putin has made clear that he considers Ukraine rightfully Russian. He wants Ukraine not out of defense or anything to do with NATO, but to maintain and grow the Russian Empire. All right. So, to reiterate, I'm not saying this was legal. It, under the U.S. Constitution, it clearly was not. The attack on Venezuela was not constitutional. Not saying it was a good idea. That's hard to say. Not saying it was moral in some greater sense, because that, I think, involves more work. But some middle, basic level, hey, is it justified or just obviously an easy attack? Well, you got a legitimate threat because Venezuela is close enough to the U.S., close to our shipping lanes, close to our military bases. It's in the Gulf of Mexico, which is also called the Gulf of America for some reason. And Venezuela's worked with literal terrorists as well as China and Russia, who the U.S. could easily be in war with. And so that's a legitimate down-the-road threat, and you combine that with it being an inherently evil and illegitimate leadership, attacking is justified at some base level. And Ukraine is considerably different, because Ukraine, isn't nearly as big of a threat to Russia, because unlike Russia, NATO is a defensive alliance. But there's some legitimacy there of it being a threat. But the bigger point is Ukraine, while being far from perfect, is a struggling democracy, and it's nothing like this real evil leadership that we have in Venezuela. So it doesn't meet the second requirement for the lone candle doctrine of justifying an attack. Anyway, well, that's Reply Guy with Lone Candle. Like me, comment me, love me. End stream.